7.1 million people. That's more than the total population of Ireland, or New Zealand, or Costa Rica. It's also the number of people who have fled Venezuela since 2014. The complex humanitarian emergency in Venezuela has been dubbed the most underfunded refugee crisis in modern history. For this episode of Protect the World, I headed to the small Colombian town of Pamplona, around 80 kilometers from the Venezuelan border, to spend a week with On the Ground International, a grassroots NGO who are working on the front lines of the Venezuelan refugee crisis. But before I tell you about this incredible organization, let's learn a little bit about Venezuela's recent history and why this crisis exists in the first place. Venezuela is the most oil-rich country on the planet, home to around 18% of the world's total oil reserves. In 2004, when oil prices boomed, former President Hugo Chavez and his socialist government spent billions on welfare programs, cutting poverty rates in half and drastically improving the nation's healthcare and education systems. But these programs were reliant on oil prices remaining high. And when oil prices plummeted in 2014, so did Venezuela. Hyperinflation quickly made the Venezuelan currency almost worthless, meaning that most of the population couldn't afford food or medicine. Starvation and crime rates have skyrocketed in recent years, and all the while, current President Nicolas Maduro has consolidated his power and turned the country into an authoritarian dictatorship. Consequently, millions of Venezuelans have fled the country, with the majority heading to Colombia on foot. They're referred to as caminantes, or walkers, and are often carrying little more than a backpack of belongings and a few dollars if they're lucky. Bethani King, founder and director of On the Ground International, first came to the region in 2019. She was planning on staying for 3 months, and had no intention of starting an organization.
The original reason I founded the organization was honestly just to accept donations in a more transparent way, because people started sending me money just via my Instagram or personal checks, and I felt funny having it all go through my own bank account. And then about that time, people started messaging me on Instagram like, hey, can I come volunteer with you? And I was like, what would I do with a volunteer? I don't even know. But I was like, sure, I guess, if you really want to.
Today, On the Ground International has between 10 and 15 volunteers at any one time. And these volunteers have a wide range of responsibilities throughout the day.
At around 8:30, we have mobile aid prep, sandwich machine. So we'll make 100, 200, 500, whatever sandwiches that we need for the day, and boil eggs and prepare the fruit and water bottles for the trips. So every day we'll travel up, sometimes down the pass with a car loaded full of food. And the volunteers will go and we'll stop for each group of caminantes and give them food, ask about where they're going, give them advice for the way ahead.
Bethani and her team also offer lifts to the most vulnerable caminantes they encounter. On the day I joined them, we picked up a family of 4, including a 3-year-old girl. They told us they'd left Venezuela because the cost of a bag of rice had risen to $3, which they were unable to afford. We also met Javier, an intellectually disabled man that Bethani had encountered on these roads before. We learned that his family were no longer able to support him, and that he'd been wandering, bouncing from shelter to shelter with nowhere to go. When Bethani offered him a position at one of On the Ground shelters, where he would be given work, 3 meals a day, and a bed, he gave us all a massive hug. On the Ground International sends volunteers to assist at several shelters, and they also run 2 of their own. The first is located halfway between Pamplona and the Venezuelan border, and just 2 weeks before I visited, they'd recorded 147 caminantes in a single night. They provided each of them with a warm bed and a safe place to rest. The second shelter is located in the middle of the Berlin Pass, a hazardous part of the route that reaches 4,000 meters above sea level, and where temperatures drop below freezing at night. Despite a number of caminantes dying from exposure along this stretch, opening a shelter here wasn't easy. There was huge pushback from the community, culminating in a town meeting where Bethany withstood a barrage of angry and spiteful comments towards her work and Venezuelans more generally.
It was just very emotionally draining, 3-hour conversation with these people, and I left that meeting just feeling so sick. It was so discouraging. We got back to the shelter, and that afternoon, a farmer came by with 2 bags of potatoes. Didn't say anything, just left 2 bags of potatoes on the porch for us. And then the next morning, I'm walking with this group of caminantes, and there's a maybe 8-year-old kid right next to me, and we're walking along, and it happened so fast I almost missed it. But another probably 8 to 10-year-old Colombian boy on his way to school walked right past us, and as he passed the Venezuelan kid, he pulled a chocolate bar out of his pocket and just stuck it in the hand of the Venezuelan kid. And I thought, okay, to me I was like, okay, there are still good people here. Yes, the people who came to this meeting are pretty ugly and pretty nasty, but they're actually a minority. There are only 20 people at this meeting probably, and they had really nasty things to say, but I think there are a lot of people in this community that are very supportive of what we're doing. They're just quieter, and they're going to show their support in very quiet ways.
In addition to the shelters, Bethany has also begun several community projects, including a kids program in one of the low-income areas of Pamplona. A number of the Venezuelan children there aren't able to go to school yet, either because they don't have the correct papers or because they can't afford the cost of a uniform. On the grounds, volunteers run classes throughout the day, teaching the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, so that these kids aren't too far behind when they do eventually get to school. For those that can attend school, many of them are unable to afford lunch, and consequently, around midday every day, the center is swarmed by dozens of children, Venezuelans and Colombians alike, who are provided with a nutritious meal. In the afternoons, the center is open for everyone, providing a safe space for the kids to play and have fun.
One of the goals with that is to actually help the Venezuelan and Colombian kids mix, because there tends to be a lot of animosity between the two, and so just to get them all on the same playground together, playing soccer together, jump roping together, just hey, look, we're not so different after all. That's been a huge thing to watch that develop.
Bethany also stresses that despite the situation in Venezuela being more subtle than Ukraine or Syria, the level of suffering certainly isn't.
What I've learned actually from working everywhere I've worked with refugees, I've learned people will do absolutely everything they can to be able to stay in their homes. I think we often in the West, we have this idea of oh, they're trying to come into our country, we live in the best country in the world, and so they want a part of it. That's really not true. Most people will do anything they can to stay in their home, and they only leave when they are completely out of options.
On the Ground International is an incredible organization, working tirelessly to help those most affected by the complex humanitarian emergency in Venezuela. From the shelters providing food and accommodation for the caminantes, to the community projects that assist them in making a fresh start, Bethany and her team of dedicated volunteers are making a significant impact in the lives of some of the world's most vulnerable people. Thanks for tuning in to our second episode of Protect the World. Last month, I started a Patreon, and thanks to our incredible supporters, On the Ground International was the first organisation that I've been able to give some money towards. It wasn't a crazy amount, a little over $100 US, but every cent will be going towards supporting Venezuelan refugees. If you're able to spare a few dollars a month to help me continue to share the stories of more incredible NGOs and contribute to their work, I would be extremely grateful. You can sign up to our Patreon via the link in the description, and I will see you next month for another episode of Protect the World.